Good afternoon, and welcome to Invariant's Dialogue for Change. Get out the vote, how companies can support civic engagement. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the event, please type them in the chat box. Invariant's Dialogue for Change series facilitates conversations on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for companies and members of the policy community interested in engaging on relevant cultural and business issues. I'm Morgan Vigna, a principal in Invariant's National Security Practice Group. Having been involved in both politics and policy for my entire career, I can attest that in the past few years, I've seen a dramatic shift by the private sector to encourage their workforce towards civic engagement. And I think this has a lot to do with Americans in general being more active in this space. The 2020 presidential election saw exceptionally high voter engagement and turnout. 68% of eligible voters cast ballots in 2020, the highest for any national election since 1900. According to the Brookings Institute, turnout increased by 10 points among Asian voters, 6 points among Latino and Hispanic voters, and 6 points among non-college educated white voters. Young adult turnout rose by 8 points, with over half of this group voting. Gen Z voters had the highest turnout rate so far in this century for their age group. The Census Bureau's current population survey indicates that the 2020 voting spike occurred across both Democratic-leaning and demographic end groups and Republican-leaning ones. Corporate America played a notable role in driving increased voter turnout with widespread, nonpartisan civic engagement programs. In the months leading up to the 2020 election, iconic brands and business leaders took unprecedented steps to get out the vote. Today, we will hear from 3 experts about the importance of civic engagement, how companies are uniquely positioned to make a difference, and the big and small ways companies are getting out the vote. We have 3 experts and leaders in the area of corporate civic engagement here to discuss this important topic. First up is Juliet Boberg. She is the Director of Corporate and Organizational Partnerships at the League of Women Voters of the United States, helping brands and organizations utilize the League of Women Voters' trusted resources and expertise to increase civic engagement across the country. Previously, she was Senior Director of Impactual, where she supported civic nonprofits, influencers, and brands, including Snapchat and Paramount, in building impactful civic programming around election cycles. We have Margaret Taylor. She is the Head of Public Affairs and Strategic Relations at Salesforce. She oversees policy communications for the Global Government Affairs team, sharing the Salesforce innovation story and company's commitment to stakeholder capitalism. Her team also manages Salesforce's strategic relations, partnering with multilateral organizations to drive forward policy and societal goals. In addition, Margaret's team runs the company's global civic engagement program. Prior to joining Salesforce, Margaret was the Director of Global Public Affairs at AT&T Services, where she led advocacy communications, partnerships with third-party partners and experts, and helped launch the AT&T Aspire EdTech Accelerator. Amber Nicole Yanez works in government relations for the nation's largest home improvement retailer and Fortune 20 company, the Home Depot. Since starting with the company in 2022, she has taken their political action committee from the 9th largest corporate PAC to the 4th. In this role, she is responsible for managing the company's political action committee and developing effective political and fundraising strategies to enhance and support the retail industry's business priorities. Welcome. We're not done yet. Prior to being with the Home Depot, Amber was Senior Vice President at Grand Valley Consulting, where she directed fundraising efforts and raised millions of dollars in PAC support for multiple leaders in Congress. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's get this conversation started. So Julia, let's start with you and talk a little bit more about the importance of civic engagement and why companies should get involved. Let's just start with a basic question. Like, why should companies care about civic engagement and voter turnout?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on this call and for hosting this really important conversation in this pivotal election year. My role at the League of Women Voters exists because we have seen that corporate civic engagement is key to building a healthy and participatory electorate. Businesses are entities that the American public trusts. I feel like everybody always talks about the Edelman Trust Barometer on panels like this, so I'm not going to go into that. But we know that businesses are entities that the American public trusts. And very importantly, businesses have more reach to the general electorate than civic nonprofits like ours, frankly, have. I'm going to share a little bit of data quickly. Data from Tufts research arm Circle in 2022 showed that only about half of young voters were contacted by any kind of political campaign or nonprofit organization in the lead up to the midterm election. But those who were contacted were 29 points more likely to vote than those who weren't. About a third of young people who didn't vote in 2022 reported that they didn't have enough information on what's going to be on their ballot or where to vote. And about 1 in 5 said that they had trouble registering to vote. So despite there being an increase in voter turnout over the past few cycles, which is incredible, there's still this really blatant need to get more nonpartisan voting information into the hands of more voters. And brands have the reach and the trust to be able to do that. So the reason why my job exists at the League of Women Voters and why we have a whole program dedicated to corporate civic engagement is to do just that. We work with brands to bring our trusted nonpartisan resources and support to more voters by meeting them where they're at. And that's at work. That's in their HR systems. It's in company emails. It's in Slack channels. It's also in their consumption habits. It's in their online shopping experience, in their favorite store that they walk into. We need to get these resources to more voters by reaching them where they are. So these kinds of partnered civic programs are really key to building and maintaining a healthy democracy. On the flip side, from the company and sort of stakeholders perspective, and I obviously want to pass it off to the corporate representatives on the call to talk a little bit more about this, but it's good for the brand's bottom line. There's plenty of recent research showing that there is an increased expectation, particularly from younger generations, for brands to step up on issues that their audience cares about. It builds brand loyalty, it builds employee loyalty, and a sense of community. So it's really a win-win from both sides.
Got it. So it sounds like voter education is good for business.
What they say.
So Amber, can you share an anecdote about how the Home Depot Civic Engagement Program has had a positive impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Morgan, and thank you to Invariant for having me on today, and also Morgan for your stellar introduction. But something that worked really well for Home Depot this year, it's something we tried completely new. We hadn't done it before. I'm sure for the folks on the call, y'all have an annual meeting where you gather a large sum of either your stakeholders or your employees in general. We had that at the Home Depot. It's called Store Manager Meeting. We have 2,300 stores all over the country. So we have more than almost 3,000 store managers. And what we did, instead of having them advocate for a policy issue that's important to the company, with it being an election year, we were like, how can we make this about get out the vote? We ask a lot of these folks, how can we give back and do something for them? So we were sure to, when we hosted all of these employees in a certain part of the country back in March, we gave them the resources to register to vote, lead them to an action site, which I can talk more about later, called homedepotvotes.com, that allows them and their families to register to vote, volunteer to be a poll worker, or work at a polling location, and then also see who the candidates are on the ballot. Going back to Juliet's point, a lot of these folks they're busy. They don't have time to do a lot of research on these candidates. How convenient would it be to just have it in one spot? One thing that I particularly like about this tool is Home Depot doesn't endorse candidates. We don't tell them who they should vote for. We just give them the resources to make the educated decision on their own. And through that activation, we registered more than 1,800 employees to register to vote over a 2-day period, which was a huge success. And happy to talk more about that later, but we gamified it. We made it a fun little competition, and it drove a lot of engagement.
No, that's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about how you were specifically able to get so many people registered, and what was the incentive there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, coming from Home Depot, we are working in the stores. We are salesmen by trade. So, numbers matter to us. So what we did is we made it a competition amongst our store managers. At Home Depot, we're separated by 3 divisions: Northern, Southern, and Western. And what we did is we made it more relevant to the company and not so much the election in November, because as we're going to talk about, it's a very tumultuous election cycle, as it has been the last couple of years. What we did is we brought it back to the company to make it fun for our employees. So we made it an election amongst our presidents of the division, to where if you registered to vote, you were given a ballot, which was a ping pong ball, to where if you registered, you were given a ballot to vote for your division president. At the end of the day, it makes your boss's boss look great. Who doesn't want that? And so through that, we got that huge turnout because they wanted to make their peers and their group look good.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing. Very creative. Margaret, can you talk a little bit about what unique resources or capabilities companies have that actually make them effective in promoting civic engagement?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. There's a few things that are really important for companies to realize they have access to when talking to their employees about programs like this. So one is that you have executives that I think, was just mentioned by Amber, like you want to impress them. So how do you make sure you have buy-in from the top down to ensure that this is a company welcomed program? It's not something that you have to mandate by any stretch of the imagination, but lots of folks want to give their employees an outlet to be engaged in the things that they care about, because companies can't work on or have an opinion on every single issue. And there's a lot that people care about. Secondly, I think one of the resources we have, I'm at Salesforce. We have a product called Slack, a communications tool. So we obviously lean in very heavily there, but there are other ways that that companies communicate with their employees on a regular basis. So whether that's through email and internet, it's websites that they're standing up for particular programs, or on Slack channels. How do you ensure that there is a cadence, not just during a presidential election cycle, but all year long, every year? Because getting out the vote isn't a once every 4-year thing here in the US. And we certainly have employees across the globe who are also voting in Democratic elections. So that's something that we think about too. What are the resources necessary to communicate with people locally? Where are they getting their information? And so you can reach people who are, especially for us as a technology company and others like ours, you're at a computer a lot of the day. You're being communicated with, but it's, maybe you have stores like the Home Depot does, and, there's information in break rooms or whatever works for you to reach your employees. But there's so many options. And I think sometimes when you're looking at starting a Get Out the Vote program or a nonpartisan civic engagement piece, it feels like it's supposed to be a reaction to something that's happening at a particular moment in time, when reality, it's something that is a way for your government affairs team to partner with employee resource groups. It's a way for, like I mentioned, you to give your employees an outlet. And it's also one thing I always talk about. It's a way to humanize your government relations team, who's often having to advocate for really tough issues and in front of, very important people. And I think there's still a little bit of a view that they're, in cigar-filled rooms and they're going to parties and they're not really doing substantive work. But that's so not true, as we know on the phone here. And it really helps build those relationships. And then the last piece I would say too is, like, one of the things that we do is that we do have site town halls. So we're mostly urban campuses at Salesforce. And so, let's take Atlanta as an example. If our Atlanta office is having a site council, our government affairs representative there, we empower them to have information to be able to have in their speaking remarks, like, you have a primary election coming up, you need to register by this day, here are your options, or we're going to have a speaker series on, we're doing one next week with our partners at Morning Consult about how to understand political and public policy issue polling. Like, what does it mean? How does that work? So, you just got to find the resources that excite your employees, but you know how to communicate it. You're talking to, you work with your employee comms team.
No, I think that's great, Morgan. I especially liked your point about civic engagement being global, that it's not just limited here to the United States. So a very, very important point. We've got a question in the chat and that I think particularly relevant that Margaret, you and Amber may be able to sort of answer quite well. And that is, how do you handle the partisan divide, especially if senior management, C-level, has expressed a political viewpoint either in the press or through donating, when there are employees that may feel ostracized by just having different political views or opinions?
Yeah, Margaret, if you don't mind, I can take this one first. That's a really good question. The Home Depot has had a few instances where I'm really proud of this company where we don't comment publicly on social issues. At the end of the day, we are here to sell hammers, to make it very simple. But to keep in mind that if you make a statement on a social issue, keep in mind that you're also leaving a potential to alienate 50% of your workforce with that opinion. So we're careful of that. But at the end of the day, we will have folks who used to be affiliated with this company make a huge donation, for example. And that's why there's collaboration involved in a company. And it's super important to always have your talking points in a row to where when that instance happens, you can speak to your comms team and there's a quick reaction and statement that just reminds associates that, hey, Home Depot didn't do this. Someone may be affiliated with the company or whatever. But you always have to keep in mind, you want to have a constant line of communication with your employees to where it's similar to government relations, to where you don't want to have to build a relationship when something's gone wrong. You want a relationship already intact. You want our messaging points to where they know that we don't do certain things, to where when they see things in the news or hear things, they already know that's not the case. And if they do hear something, they need to know the contact to reach out to get the actual information. So it goes back to, if you don't have a grassroots program or a civic engagement program now, get it intact to where when these instances happen, they know who to reach out to, but also they know the story first.
No, I think that's great. Thank you. Margaret, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think every company is different for what's authentic to it. We certainly are engaged in what is often considered social issues on a fairly regular basis. And what, being a public affairs practitioner, the way that I look at it is you know what some of the core hot button issues are. Have you done tabletop exercises to understand how it impacts all of the stakeholders that you care about? How did you make a decision to weigh in or not on an issue? And then how are you going to communicate that clearly? So, there may be things that could be alienating to a particular group of employees, a particular group of customers, even potentially. We have to, our customers are deeply important. And how are you going to justify the decision that you have made? So, we have had questions about the stances we take on particular issues from both employees and customers, and obviously the media, but especially with our customers and our employees, we explain exactly why we did it and how it aligns with our policy platform. And, we have not had an issue with that. Not everyone's going to like everything that we do. And that's really, it's hard. So how can you be transparent and authentic to your voice and to how your company shows up in every way? So, we're not going to weigh in really heavily on something that we doesn't align with not only our core values, but are we showing up in other ways for our employees, both internally or in our community externally? So that's how we take a look at that.
Got it. Thank you. All right. Well, so I want to turn over to sort of doing a deep dive into sort of best practices here. Now, each of you have in-depth experience managing corporate civic engagement programs and partnerships. And so I want to talk a little bit about what your companies are doing and the best practices for other companies and organizations that want to get out the vote. So for Amber, let's start with you. What spurred the Home Depot to become involved in civic engagement? And in your mind, what is the one that has been the most impactful and why?
Mhm. So as Morgan said, I've only been with the Home Depot for 2 years. So we've had this program for 10 plus years now. But when we really doubled down was during COVID. As Morgan mentioned, I also run our PAC, and COVID was not a good time for political action committees. A lot of corporations were shutting down their PACs, not soliciting. And so during that time, Home Depot was really smart and made the case to our higher ups to where, okay, we're not going to do a PAC solicitation, but we are going to have the biggest get out the vote campaign that you've ever seen. And they pulled it off. And so that's what encouraged us and inspired us to really make this a priority within not only GR, but the company as a whole, to really go hand in hand with the other civic engagement that we have at the company. We have our foundation, we have volunteer hours, we have our policy advocacy, town halls like Margaret spoke about. But that missing component really was making sure that our associates had the tools and resources to get out the vote. We worked with internal partners like legal, HR, internal comms to get the message out, but also when we worked with HR, we were making sure that associates had 4 hours of time off to go vote in the middle of the day. Or with HomeDepotVotes.com, they had the resource to request the absentee ballot or the mail-in ballot, because during COVID, you couldn't go to a polling location. And that really, COVID was an awful time, but it really jump-started our advocacy to a level that I'm really proud of it is today.
That's really great that you were able to find those sorts of opportunities, particularly during such dark times. So no, kudos to the Home Depot for that. Okay, so Margaret, can you tell us a little bit about how Salesforce supports civic engagement among employees and what resources you offer them?
Sure. So each year, so our civic engagement program has been around since before I started at Salesforce as well. But it's been in action about 8.5, 9 years. And what we've done over time is try to do something new every single year. So, the basics is, how do you give people the tools to register to the vote? So I just noted back to someone who asked a question, how do you measure if people are? We use TurboVote as our partner for that. So you can sign up not just to register to vote, but also for reminders and information about your polling location and all sorts of data that you might need to your specific place of where you live. We do work with Power of the Polls for nonpartisan poll working as well, which we really pushed forward during the pandemic, for example, because we know that the average poll worker is over the age of 65 and was at risk during COVID. And we're a technology company, so our employees typically skew a little bit younger. So we're less at risk than some others. And it was really well received. And data shows that people, once they do it once, they're more likely to do it again. But we do year-long speaker series, as I mentioned, and they're not necessarily on an election. They're about things that are about the democratic process. So I mentioned we're doing one about polling next week. We've done things about privacy and how to stay safe online after the Dobbs decision, when people were concerned about their data, if they're looking for reproductive health care clinics. So there are things that you can do to give people the resources to feel like they can be empowered to be a civic participant. I will call out a couple other things that we've been thinking a lot about in partnership with our employee resource groups. So last week, we had our Bring Your Kids to Work Day, which is called Adventure Club here at Salesforce. And we worked with Salesforce Parents and Families, one of our resource groups, to teach your children how to vote. And so these characters here, we have characters all over the office. That's for a different conversation, but we do have a handful of them. And so we had ballot boxes made, and about 1,000 kids in 4 offices cast their ballot for their favorite character. And so it's teaching them to vote, teaching them what that looks like, the fun of it, and that it can be an exciting thing to do. The other thing that was kind of interesting that we did last year is we made 4 videos about how different parts of the government works, called Salesforce Rocks. So if you're familiar with Schoolhouse Rock, which I hope everyone still is, maybe I'm aging myself, but we had a series of 4 videos that we filmed in DC on the National Mall with our government affairs team about how things work, so people can understand the process and have resources throughout the year. And then, like, the last thing that I would mention about this as well, that I think has been kind of a fun thing we've done, is we try to incorporate it in other existing events. So at Dreamforce, our largest conference, like, we've done voter registration at our like future executive summit. So younger guests who are coming, we really try and put some stuff out during other kind of like welcome back to the office activities, kind of where we can fit in naturally with what's happening as a company, so it's not a standalone. And I think that really helps, because it is a company resource. It's not a government affairs only resource. And that helps make sure that feels that way and feels supported.
Right, right. So Juliet, how does the League of Women Voters partner with companies to increase voter turnout? And second part to this question, what have the most successful corporate partnerships with the League of Women Voters looked like?
Sure. So it really depends, sort of to Amber and Margaret's points, on the partner. We want to build partnerships that are bespoke, that are authentic to our partner's brand, voice, audience interests, and channels of communication that they own. But there's some sort of core features that we focus on with our partners. The first is vote411.org. Vote411 is the League's 501c3 nonpartisan one-stop shop for all of the election tools and information that anybody across the country needs to cast their ballot. And we can include that in a follow-up email to folks in case they're interested. But on it, there's a register to vote tool. There's a detailed ballot guide, which I'm really passionate about getting out to more voters. If you input your address, it populates a ballot guide down to the local level that has information on all of the candidates and what they stand for that are going to be on your ballot, as well as information on all of the ballot measures that are going to be on your ballot as well. The site also has a state map that, if you click on your state, includes information on how to request an absentee ballot, voter ID laws, anything you could possibly need to know is all packaged up in one place. We have the ability to custom brand our Vote411 site for our partners. So I can share an example. Target is a partner of ours, and they have a beautiful branded Vote411 page that they use as their center that they then can send out via a simple link, vote411.org/target, to their employees across their entire civics program leading up to 2024. So all of the steps that they need their employees to take to be able to vote on election day or before election day if they're early voting, they can take via this branded site. The second thing that we focus on is educational events. So the League has experts across all different facets of democracy, and we can bring them in to do panels and fireside chats and workshops with employees, and have seen much success doing this with employee resource groups, to talk about what's at stake in this election and how to get involved effectively. So an example of that is Microsoft, a partner of ours. We hosted a virtual fireside chat with our chief of programs earlier this year to talk about, with their Women at Microsoft employee resource group, what's at stake in this election for women, why state and local elections matter, and how they can get involved in their local community by connecting to the over 750 local League chapters across the country. We also do mis and disinformation trainings, which I'll get into a little bit more later, but mis and disinformation is a huge issue that we're seeing in this election trend that is becoming more of an issue, along with AI and deepfakes. So We do trainings on that with our partners. And then the third thing is in-person activations. So with our 750 local leagues across the country, we're able to come in person and do tabling and civic workshops in offices or at events. So we worked with the Mystics, the WNBA team in DC, for instance, on doing voter registration and education tabling in stadiums at their games. And then we created a Vote 411 page for them that they promoted on the Jumbotron over the PA and then through their digital communications as well. So it was really cool and effective to see the connection between their sort of national digital program to the actual in-person experience of fans in the stadium. And we're going to do some work with them in the fall around National Voter Registration Day for that too. To the point of what we have seen be most effective, I think Amber and Margaret spoke to it. I mean, being authentic and on brand is key and most important. We did work with Say Beauty, the makeup brand, about a month ago around the anniversary of the Dobbs decision. We did a co-post on Instagram talking about why reproductive justice is a democracy issue, and then linking people to the Vote 411 ballot guide to see where the candidates in their area stand on reproductive justice. This is, of course, not something that I would recommend to all brands, but Say has from the start been outspoken about reproductive justice because they know that that's something that the young women in their audience really care about. So they connected that issue to the 2024 election and to our tools, and it was a really effective post, and we're working with them on some more. I would say working with ERGs is really effective, which Amber and Margaret both spoke to, talked about the Microsoft work that we're doing. That webinar that we did with them was super engaging. We had 350 people join. And from that, we're actually planning more activations in the fall with specific offices with the Women at Microsoft group. And then I would say, and Margaret, you spoke to this too, just making sure that you have a campaign that has multiple touch points across, 365 days a year. I think if a company comes the week before election day and says, oh, by the way, election day is next week, go vote, that's not that helpful. Like it's better than doing nothing, but it's going to be way more effective if you've been working with them for the past year to integrate civic participation into their everyday experience at work. Yeah, I'll pause there.
All really amazing points. Thank you, Juliet. All right, so this is a question just for everyone. And we'll start with Amber. If you had to pick one core component of a successful corporate civic engagement platform, what would it be?
Ooh, you're putting me on the spot, but if I had to pick one component, what comes first to mind is like where I would start is buy-in from the very top of your organization. It's just so much easier to do things within your company when you have someone as high as it goes saying, yes, this is a good idea. And we can talk later into how to get their buy-in because that's super important and where you need to start. But it just helps you work within the organization, help identify your internal partners, but also get the resources you need to make all of these projects successful. So that's what I think is what comes first to mind when I say what's most important.
Mm-hmm. Margaret?
I agree with Amber, but I would say pick one thing and just do it really well and measure it and talk about it. Because that's going to also get you results that you can point to. You're going to get feedback from your employees, and you're going to be able to point to something to leadership internally that says, we did this one thing, we're doing it really well, and this is the positive reaction that we're getting. How do we get resourced to do more?
Mm-hmm. Right. Juliet?
I would say this is maybe not number one, but from a nonprofit partner's perspective, I think it is very important to choose your nonprofit partners wisely and then lean on them for the expertise and the actual programming that you want to execute. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to build everything from scratch. There are groups in this ecosystem that are doing the work and would love to have more corporate partners to expand and build on that. So I would encourage everybody to partner with nonprofits.
Not biased at all. Okay, so Margaret, I want to turn back to you because you specifically said referenced measurement. And so when we see civic engagement programs being launched, clearly it's daunting, but doesn't necessarily have to be. I want to talk a little bit about how companies overcome challenges, start small and incorporate innovative approaches to streamline this process. So Margaret, talk to me about how Salesforce's civic engagement program has evolved over time and what has driven those changes.
Sure. So, I mean, we started out with, like many companies, how do you give people the resources to register to vote? And what does that mean? And we did partner with organizations, third-party organizations. And so I love that Juliet mentioned that, because there are resources available. And I think there's a lot of sophisticated ones now too. So there's, technology helps so much in that, and the additional corporate interest does. But what we started out with Get Out the Vote campaigns, and then it was, okay, so how do we like bring people in, right? So, you do the speakers, you bring your local mayors in for a conversation with your executives. So I think a lot of times those are thought of as separate activities. We think about it as a joint effort for both government affairs needs and our overall civic engagement program. If you're bringing in an elected official, an appointed official, and they're providing information about what they're doing within their community, so their official capacity, it's not that's not a fundraiser. That's a civic engagement program. And even though they may be affiliated with a political party, that's a nonpartisan activity. We do the same thing for whoever is in that office at any given time. The other things that we've grown over the years have been, I mentioned the nonpartisan poll working. We also built modules on our free online learning platform, Trailhead, of how to be civically engaged. So how to, find your polling location, how to make a plan to vote. We work with employee relations and employment legal to ensure that our employees have time off to vote. We also make sure, we have communications for people leaders, that we remind them how people should talk about things in an election cycle. What's our Slack online community, chat-a-kit that we want people to abide by, to make sure that people are feeling the information that's being shared on our platforms is nonpartisan, and that they are not, disproportionately excluding a member of the community. We also, as I mentioned, have talk tracks that we prep for things, whether there's an issue, but also when something's like going really well, like, maybe we had 500 employees sign up for something, and we want to kind of shout that from the rooftop. So we'll add those wins in as well, because I think that's really important, so people feel encouraged to also participate. The other thing I'd say too is we do the measurement piece and bring that along, and that's really important in the growth of the program, because it makes it, you have some tangibility of why you're investing. So we can measure how many people are signing up for election reminders or to register to vote from our partner platform, TurboVote. We also know how many people are coming to our speaker series or watching recordings. We also do some stuff that's, in person only, right? We just had a fireside chat with a mayor in one of our larger offices, and there was essentially like a wait list to come into that. So, you've got 150 people in the room asking questions, taking an hour of their day, because it's important to them to know what's happening in their community. And we're replicating, we replicate that on a regular basis. And then the last thing that I would say that I think is really important too is, do people want to work with you again? And so I know that's kind of like that qualifiable, not quantifiable piece, but we work so closely with our equality team, and we work closely with workforce development and legal. And we do that because there are implications for all of our employees in different ways when it comes to being civically engaged. And so, it's really important to not just have that buy-in from the top, but like, who are those people that are your partners to be able to execute programs? And if they don't think it's important, it probably means something wasn't going right, something didn't rub the right way. And instead, we've been able, luckily, to expand over the years, which is why we've been able to do more resources, because we can't make those decisions on our own. I'm not employment, legal, or employee resources. Like, I can't choose that our employees get time off to vote, but we as a company think it's important enough altogether to do that.
Sure. So I've got a question here from the audience, and it's an interesting one, but I'm sure it's sort of on the minds of many. So how do you handle situations where folks have, outwardly show or demonstrate their political affiliations or political preferences, whether it's, in the workplace in general?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. One thing I will note, so we neighborhood in all of our offices, so nobody has an office, nobody has a dedicated desk. So it would be a lot of work for someone to be dragging stuff in and out of their cubby every day, but I've yet to see it, but that does not mean it's not going to happen. So we tend to not have sort of the collection of materials that most places do. I'm sure others have some feedback on that. But we do include in our employee code of conduct and in our Slack, because that's our primary form of communication, Slack, and our Slack guidelines, what you can and how you can and cannot talk about political or social issues in the workplace. And like it's levied evenly across everything. You are allowed to share information with one another if it's respectful, but like we also are really worried about that dis and misinformation piece that Juliet mentioned too. So like we have some guidelines around like what you can also share, because people have different opinions about what media outlets are considered trustworthy or not, and things like that. So we've thought a lot about that, actually in partnership with our ethical and humane use of technology team too, because it's something that, is a product issue as well. Like when you think about how people are using our products. So the thing I would mention about that is that you just have to you got to have the team in place that everybody's really comfortable, that you have policies that are written down, that are legally sound, that what your different stakeholders have been ready to have. And then how are you making sure that you have the structure in place to enforce them in a way that you are comfortable with? Like, we're not, ours is more like, hey, we're gonna, as a reminder on the Slack channel, this is no longer, how you can talk about these issues, just like a reminder about our Slack community guidelines. We're not, setting off like massive firestorms about something that's going on. But like that is something, we've had to work through over the last few years as people bring more and more to the office. And it is a challenge. I don't think that we should admit that it's not. But that's more of where ours shows up. And I think that that's becoming more common when I talk to peers at other companies. It's less a hat in the office or a poster in the office. It's more, how are they communicating with each other during the day?
Amber, do you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
I completely agree with everything Margaret said. The great thing is that if you're in government relations, you don't have to have all the answers on how to solve this problem. You have legal, you have employee relations. Most of the time, they may have something already in place that has already been approved. One thing that Margaret said that was really important, but you have to be really careful, is make sure you have these guidelines in place in writing and you're ready to follow and implement them. But make sure that they're not too broad to where you could apply it to anything and everything, to where an associate could be like, okay, well, what about this? But you can't make it too specific to where you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So everything Margaret said, I completely agree with.
Great. So Amber, I want to turn back to you for a hot second here. What are some of the biggest challenges to corporate civic engagement that you think hold companies back from participating? And what are some ways that companies can start small to make those challenges more navigable?
Yeah, I think external challenges, we have all seen with the turn of the times, cancel culture, boycott culture. And companies want to do the right thing, but sometimes it's either not discussed amongst a diverse group where the ideas are run by back and forth, and you can figure out if there are any pitfalls to these ideas, or what have you. So I think companies are just nervous that they're going to try to do something good and it's not going to be received by all audiences that way. Internal challenges, I think, we're all very spread thin. What are the resources? What's the time? Who's going to lead this? Why are we doing it? And I think that if you're someone on this call who's wanting to do this, the stats that Juliet had at the very beginning of this, like, I want to take them because they were so good to really stress to your higher ups why having a program like this is so important. Start with that. And then, Morgan, as you were saying, start very small. You can expand into having your teletown halls and having your own website and all of that later. Right now, it's July. We have about 100 days until the election. You can definitely have just a register to get your employees registered to vote at your headquarters or in your offices. And that's a pretty safe thing to do. Talk to your legal, talk to everyone else that you need to consult before doing that. But just start small with something like that, and then you can build up the program next year to where in 2026, like, you're rocking and rolling, ready to go.
Really good points. Juliet, I want to get back to what you were talking about earlier about misinformation, disinformation, and technology. So what emerging trends are you seeing that you think will shape the future of corporate civic engagement?
Yeah, so I spoke to this a bit, but mis and disinformation has been on the rise for several election cycles. We're seeing foreign influence attempt to persuade American voters on social media, and with the creation of false news stories that appear to be digital news content. We've seen candidates and campaigns spread false information designed to confuse or prevent voters from participating in elections. This kind of propaganda is a very prevalent and increasing tactic by bad actors, and is something that the League is actively working to combat. We have a program called Democracy Truth Project, where we're working with state and local leagues on training local community members on how to identify mis and disinformation, and then also working to combat it. And we're actually partnered with an AI organization to use large language models, and I am not the person to talk about this because I don't have the vocabulary, but using LLM to create counter narratives to mis and disinformation around voting that we're seeing come up. And then we're using that messaging and working with local league and community members to disseminate that to combat the mis and dis that we're seeing. So that's probably too much information, but this is something that the League is really focused on. And we do mis and dis trainings for our partners if they're interested. So we can train people on the basics of how to vet sources, how to identify mis and dis, and then how to combat it effectively using social media. The second thing is AI. The use of artificial intelligence in elections work is pretty new this cycle, and we honestly don't really know where it's going to go. But we've already seen AI deepfakes play a role in spreading disinformation to voters. I don't know if you all saw earlier this year in the New Hampshire primary election, but a bad actor used illegal AI-generated robocalls to discourage voters from participating in that election. There was a deepfake simulated voice of President Joe Biden telling voters on the phone to save their vote, not go to the polls, and wait until November 2024 to vote in the US presidential election, which is blatant voter suppression. The League actually, our C4, took legal action in New Hampshire against this. But that kind of AI deepfake simulated voices, simulated images are going to be much more prevalent this year, and make the spread of mis and disinformation much more of a problem. So both of those trends we're seeing emerge and grow really show that it is important now more than ever that voters have access to verified, trusted sources of information, and brands can play a really important role in that.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question for all of you. And this is sort of as we are getting very excited about November and we're putting a lot of resources and energy towards getting out the vote. November will come, election day will come, and the sun will rise the next day, right? How do you maintain the momentum after an election and during off years? What's the secret sauce there? Let's start with Amber on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. I think the beautiful thing about civic engagement is it's not all about get out the vote. It's whether if you're a company that has a foundation or you have charitable partners, or like Juliet was saying, your nonprofit partners, it's about supporting them, getting out in the community. I mean, Home Depot has 2,300 stores all over the country. We are pillars in the community. It's our responsibility to make sure that our associates are out there and in their community and making it a better place for our employees and customers. It's volunteering, it is having these town halls like Margaret mentioned, and making sure that you are educating your employee base on the issues that matter to the company, but also issues that matter to them. They're not drones that only care about Home Depot issues. They care about things when they go home, what they talk about at their dinner table, making sure that they know as employees that like the company cares about those too. So there are just so many projects and actions and groups you can work with throughout the year to where you're keeping that open dialogue to where they know you, you know them, and you can leverage them and they can leverage you. Also, I mean, grassroots, it's all about engaging them in the policy advocacy that helps the bottom line as well with the company, having them get involved in advocacy efforts, bringing them up for a fly-in, bringing them to a field hearing, things of that nature that really gets them going and excited and seeing like, okay, to Margaret's point, they aren't just smoking cigars in a back room and twiddling their thumbs. They're actually out there advocating for them as individuals.
Yeah, thanks. Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to my point of like, pick something that you're going to do and do it well. And I think that's the year over year situation too. So let's pretend you didn't pick like voter registration, but though I would argue like people can register to vote at any time. So voter registration is not like a one and done thing in an election year. And a lot of times you need to be registered in certain states, so far in advance. There's all sorts of laws you got to work through. But I would say, is it going to be that you're going to do 2 events a year? It doesn't have to be not everything has to be a huge program, right? Like, what is it that your team with the resources that are available can execute? And so when I think about that is, it might be that, you're the mayor or the state representative of where your office is, that you're doing something, comes in and talks about like what they're working on, and they do that with an executive. It could be that you have an enablement program of how do you run for local office and follow the rules that you need to follow as an employee that maybe does business with governments. What it can be a lot of different things. And I know sometimes it's hard to pick and choose them, but that's also why like your employee resource groups are critical. Your government affairs team is going to be critical. And also, what are the issues that they're working on that they really want to make sure employees are aware of? Like, it might not be something, super exciting, maybe it's like a tax issue, which doesn't excite everyone, but there are people in the company that want to know about that, and they want to understand like what that team is up to. That's part of your civic engagement as well, because you're explaining to people that you are representing what you're doing on their behalf as an employee as well. And so I think sometimes we make a little bit of a mountain out of some of these programs. And that's also where, if you're partnering with League of Women Voters, how does the league come in and talk about their day-to-day activities of working with women across the country to make sure that they are civically engaged? And maybe it helps build their C3 programming as well. So there is plenty that you can do all year round. And I would also just note that Lots of places vote on lots of different things. I live in the city and county of San Francisco. We vote like every 5 months. I swear to God, like it's like a hobby out here. It's a very civically engaged place, but we need to provide information to our headquarters employees here in San Francisco more than just once or twice a year.
Yep, no, I think it's a really good point. Juliet?
I love all of the examples that you just shared, Margaret, and agree. I mean, the league is working 365 days a year. There are no off years. There are elections happening at the local level all the time, and we're active around them, and companies can be too. We're hosting candidate forums. We're registering voters. We are hosting nonpartisan get out the vote events. We can work with companies throughout the year to make civic engagement part of your everyday life and just not something that you do every 2 years in a national and a federal election. I will say too, and Margaret, you spoke to this, after Election Day, I think there's a lack of understanding of sort of how legislation actually happens and how like somebody gets elected and then what happens after that, and how that then leads to things that affect your everyday life. And that is mostly happening at the local level by local legislatures. And I think it's really important to educate your employees and consumers on that process. Like Margaret, you said, sort of bringing in a local, nonpartisan politician to talk about what they're working on, or teaching people about a bill that Salesforce is focused on. I think all of that is part of the civics education process and can happen between federal election cycles.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have 5 minutes left, and I do want to turn to a final question in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to type in your question and it's burning you inside, please type it now and we can do a lightning round. But this question is a really practical one, and it gets at speakers that companies bring in to talk to their workforce. Specifically, like, who are some guests that your companies has had for a speaker series related to civic engagement? And have you ever worried about speakers coming in or guests that could be perceived as overly partisan? Go ahead, Margaret.
Yes. Of course we do, is the answer. And we think really deeply about that. But I think a couple of things. One, as I mentioned, if it's somebody who's elected to represent the place that you are, they are affiliated with a political party, and that's okay. We're providing access to our employees, to those folks. The other thing I would say with that too is like, that's also why you drive the conversation about you agree early, right? What are your questions you're going to ask? And we always have our political compliance and ethics legal team take a look at that to make sure that we aren't violating something, because we do business with government. So we are, a registered lobbyist, not just from a government affairs perspective, but also a public sector sales perspective. And we like to make sure we're following the rules. The other piece I would say too, is that one thing that we've done in some of these more educational places is we have partnerships that we are open about, both internally and externally. Say, I'll use the example of like, we work with the ACLU on quite a few things. And so like when we've had their legal team explain how a policy topic in a case makes it to the Supreme Court. So people understand that process, as Juliet just mentioned too. And I think that's a good way of doing it. It's not necessarily talking specifically about their work, but they are experts who have argued in front of and taken cases to the Supreme Court. So they have a bird's eye view of how that happens. And people need to understand that, especially as there's more and more attention to that stuff. So there's a way to do it. I'm not going to say it's super easy necessarily internally, but and the other thing I would just say too is even when we do public events like our annual conference, like we never only have speakers from one political party if there's government representation. So last year we had 3 governors at our large conference, Dreamforce, 2 were Republicans and 1 was a Democrat.
Got it. Amber, anything you want to add to that?
Margaret's answer was perfect. I completely agree. And also just anticipating that sometimes folks will come into that room just heated up to ask a question of someone who may be speaking from the Republican point of view or Democrat point of view, and just anticipating that conflict and kind of disarming it from the very beginning in your opening remarks and just being like, hey, we have this person here. we invited them because of this reason, whether they're the representative from our state, whether they used to own a trucking company, and Home Depot transportation is very important to us. We want to speak about this issue specifically. Just sharing the strategy of, we're not just inviting this person to come because they're a Republican or Democrat. That's not the strategy behind this. But just letting your associates know this is the conversation we're going to have today. Thanks for coming.
Juliet, anything on best practices about selecting speakers or guests?
I mean, from my perspective on the nonprofit side, I think, as Margaret said, like aligning on what you want to talk about and what you want to speak to, and if there are parameters prior to the speaking engagement is, of course, going to be important. But I also think that there are really easy ways to talk about this, to talk about democracy, to talk about civic engagement in the context of things that are not polarizing. Like in our Microsoft, Women at Microsoft Employee Resource Group Fireside Chat recently, we spent 10 minutes talking about potholes with some of the members and like who is actually at the local level responsible for fixing potholes and how you can contact your representatives to fix potholes. And it's like such a mundane thing that is obviously not partisan that people really care about, that's like relevant to everybody across the country. And we literally talked about that for 10 minutes and everybody was super excited about it. So like the idea that a civics session has to be really polarizing and sort of speaking grandly about these hot button issues is just not true. Like you can bring it down to the local level and remove any sort of partisanship from it.
All right, well, thank you for that. And so we are out of time. We have come to the end of our Dialogue for Change. A special thank you to each of our panelists for today's discussion and to our attendees for joining. Please look out for follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about the Dialogue for Change speaker series and for additional diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging resources. You can also find us on X @Invariant and on LinkedIn. Thank you again for joining us today.